The knock at Edna Garrison's door came at 10:30 on a Tuesday night in the autumn of 1883, and when she opened it, every single hair on the back of her neck stood straight up. He was leaning against the door frame with one hand pressed flat to the wood and the other hanging loose at his side, fingers brushing the grip of his revolver out of pure habit rather than threat. His shirt was torn at the left shoulder and dark with dried blood. His hat was gone. His face was a map of cuts and bruises and 3 days' worth of dust from the New Mexico Trail, and his eyes, those sharp, storm-colored eyes she had spent the better part of 2 years trying to forget, were fixed on her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not defiance. Not that casual, infuriating arrogance that had made her want to slap him and kiss him in the same breath. Not even the cold, shuttered blankness he wore when lawmen came sniffing around. What she saw on Clyde Donovan's face in that moment was something raw and scraped down to the bone. He was afraid. Edna. His voice came out rougher than gravel and twice as broken. He cleared his throat. I am done running. Let me stay. She stood there in her cotton nightgown with a lantern in her hand and the warm yellow light spilling out across the porch boards, and the world she had so carefully and deliberately rebuilt around his absence came apart at the seams all at once. The rational part of her, the part that had filed his name away alongside betrayal and dark past and forbidden choices and secrets she would carry to her grave, wanted to slam the door shut, wanted to bolt it, wanted to walk back to her bedroom and pull the quilt over her head and pretend this moment had never happened. But the other part of her, the part that had never once in 2 years stopped listening for the sound of a horse on the road after dark, took one step forward. You are bleeding, she said. I know it. You look like the entire territory of New Mexico tried to kill you. Most of it did. She held the lantern higher and studied his face, looking for the lie. Clyde Donovan had never in his life said a true thing when a convenient false one would do. She knew that. She had learned it the hard way. But there was no lie in his face right now. There was only the exhaustion of a man who had run out of road. Get inside, she said. Before someone sees you on my porch and I have to explain to Sheriff Bellamy why I am harboring an outlaw at 11 o'clock at night. He pushed himself upright with an effort that told her the shoulder wound was worse than she could see, and he stepped across her threshold for the first time in 2 years, and Edna Garrison shut the door behind him and tried to remember how to breathe. To understand how they had arrived at this moment, you had to go back to the spring of 1881, to the town of Redrock, New Mexico Territory, and to the day that Edna first laid eyes on Clyde Donovan. Redrock was not much of a town. It had a general store owned by a man named Patterson who watered down his flour and would cheat you on the weight of a sack of beans if you let him. It had a saloon called the Dusty Boot that smelled like pine resin and old whiskey and bad decisions. It had a barber shop, a livery stable, a post office that was also a dentist's office on alternating Thursdays, and a church that the minister abandoned every summer when the heat became intolerable, and he took himself back east until October. It also had Edna Garrison. Edna had come to Redrock 3 years prior in 1878, following her husband Thomas Garrison, who had come west with the idea of running cattle and had instead died of a snake bite in the second spring, leaving her with 40 acres of dry but workable land, a solid stone farmhouse he had built himself before the snake bite, 2 milk cows, a vegetable garden, and no living family within 500 miles. She was 26 years old when Thomas died. She was 29 when Clyde Donovan rode into Redrock on a dun-colored horse with a stolen saddle and a warrant out for his arrest in 3 counties. She did not know about the warrant when she first saw him. She just saw a tall, lean man with dark hair and a sun-bronzed face climb down from a tired horse outside Patterson's store and push through the door without so much as a glance at the sky or the street or the other people around him, which was itself a kind of arrogance, or maybe a kind of danger. She found out later it was both. She had been at the store to buy lamp oil and cornmeal, and she had been standing at the counter waiting for Patterson to finish an argument with a farmer about a broken plow blade, and the tall man had come in and stood behind her, and she had felt the presence of him before she turned around, which irritated her. "You have been waiting long?" he asked. "Long enough," she said, and turned back to the counter. "Patterson always argues about the plow blade," he said. "He will argue another 10 minutes and then give the man half of what he is owed and call it fair. It is his way." Edna turned around then and looked at him properly. "You have been here before." "Once, 2 years back. Some things do not change." He looked at the counter, at Patterson still gesticulating over the broken blade. "The plow argument is a tradition by now, I think." She almost smiled. Almost. "I am Edna Garrison," she said. "I have a farm on the South Road." "Clyde Donovan," he said, and nothing else, which she found rude and which he apparently found sufficient. But Patterson finished his argument just then, and the farmer left in a huff, and Edna bought her lamp oil and her cornmeal, and by the time she turned to leave, Clyde Donovan was at the counter asking Patterson where a man could find a room for a reasonable price, and that should have been the end of it. It was not the end of it. It was not the end of it because Redrock was small, and because the room Clyde Donovan rented was in the boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Holt, and Mrs. Holt's boarding house was exactly half a mile down the South Road from Edna's farm, which meant they were neighbors whether they intended to be or not. The first time he appeared at her gate, it was 3 days after Patterson's store, and he was leading his horse and the horse was limping. "My horse threw a shoe and wrenched his left foreleg," he said. "I can see you have a paddock. I will pay you to let him rest here 2 or 3 days while the swelling goes down." She looked at the horse. It was clearly in pain, and she could not in good conscience say no to an animal on that account. "2 days," she said. 3 if the leg is not right. "And you do not need to pay me." "I pay for what I use," he said, and there was a firmness in it that was not pride but something adjacent, something about the careful management of obligation. She noted it. He came twice a day to check on the horse. The first day they did not speak much. The second day he asked her about the farm, and she told him about Thomas and the snakebite and the 40 acres, and she told it plainly and without sorrow, because she had processed that grief and put it in its proper place, and she was not the kind of woman who performed her pain for strangers. He listened without filling the silence with false sympathy or hollow words, which she appreciated. "You run it alone," he said. "I run it alone. That is a considerable thing." "It is an ordinary thing," she said. "Women have been running farms alone since there were farms." He looked at her with something that was not quite a smile but warmer than his usual expression. "You are right," he said. "I should have said it more carefully. I meant it with respect, not surprise." She looked at him for a moment. "Then I accepted in that spirit," she said. By the time the horse's leg was right and he had paid her with $2 silver she had not asked for and had not refused, she had begun to wonder about Clyde Donovan. He was not like the other drifters who passed through Redrock. He did not drink to excess at the Dusty Boot. He did not brag or swagger or pick fights. He read, which surprised her when she saw him sitting on the fence post with a battered copy of something by Hawthorne. He spoke with care, choosing words like he was aware of their weight. But there was something shuttered about him too, something that deflected certain questions with a smoothness so practiced she only recognized it afterward. She asked him once what he had done before coming to Redrock, and he said he had worked cattle drives and done some trade work. And the answer was not a lie, but it was not the truth either, and she felt the space around it without being able to name it. She would name it soon enough. It was the minister, of all people, the one who came back from the East every October, who told her. He arrived in the first week of October and sought her out personally, which was unusual, and told her that the man boarding at Mrs. Holt's place was Clyde Donovan of the Donovan outfit, wanted in 3 counties for robbery and in a 4th county for the shooting of a deputy marshal, and that she ought to keep her distance from him. She stood very still and listened to the minister, and thanked him and sent him on his way. Then she went inside and sat at her kitchen table and stared at the wall for a considerable time. She did not keep her distance from Clyde Donovan. She did, however, go to find him the very next morning. She found him at the livery stable rubbing down his horse, and she told him plainly what the minister had told her. He did not react the way she expected. He did not deny it or deflect it. He just kept rubbing down the horse and said, "Yes, that is mostly accurate." "Mostly," she said. "I did not shoot the deputy marshal," he said. "I disarmed him and left him tied to a fence post. He is alive." The wanted poster says otherwise because it was written by a man who hates me and a sheriff who found it convenient to make the charge more serious. "And the robbery?" He stopped rubbing the horse and looked at her. "Yes," he said simply. "What did you rob?" "A railroad payroll." "Why?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Because the railroad had just taken the land of 3 families who had worked it for 20 years by means of a forged deed and a corrupt judge, and I knew the man who had worked one of those farms since I was a child. The money I took went back to those families, every dollar of it." Edna looked at him for a long time. "That is a pretty story," she said. "It is also a true one," he said. "I am not asking you to believe it, I am just telling you what happened." She believed him. She should not have. A woman alone in the territory with 40 acres and 2 milk cows and a good stone farmhouse could not afford to believe a wanted man's story about noble robbery. But she believed him because she had been watching him for 3 weeks, and she understood something about the shape of a person. And Clyde Donovan was not a man who harmed those who could not protect themselves. She had seen it in small ways. The way he helped Mrs. Holt carry her water pails without being asked. The way he gave his place in line at the post office to an old Apache woman without even registering it as a choice. The way he talked to her farm hand, a young Mexican boy named Rafael, like he was talking to an equal. "You should leave Red Rock," she said. "If the minister knows who you are, he will talk." "I know," he said. "When will you go?" He met her eyes. "When I am ready," he said. And there was something in the way he said it that made her understand he meant something more than just the departure from the town. He stayed 3 more weeks. Those 3 weeks were, she would realize later, the most consequential of her adult life. He started helping on the farm. She did not ask him to, and he did not ask permission. He simply appeared on a Monday morning with his sleeves rolled up and said there was a section of fence on the north side that would not last another winter, and did she want him to fix it? She said yes. He fixed it. It became a kind of routine. He would come in the mornings and work, and she would work beside him or nearby, and they would talk or not talk, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind rather than the awkward kind, which told her something. At noon she fed him at her kitchen table, and they ate together and argued about things, because it turned out they had strong opinions on a remarkable variety of subjects, and their opinions frequently differed, and they were both too stubborn to back down easily, which made the arguments long and good and exhausting, and somehow deeply satisfying to both of them. He told her more about himself. Not all at once, and not in an organized way, but in pieces, the way you tell someone the important things when you trust them enough to offer the truth. He had grown up in Missouri. His father had been a horse trader and a drunkard and a man capable of a very specific brand of casual cruelty. He had left home at 16. He had worked cattle drives across Kansas for 5 years and had been honest, and had worked hard, and had been cheated systematically by the men who ran the drives. And somewhere in those years, something had calcified inside him on the subject of men with power and the people they ground underfoot. The railroad robbery had not been his first act outside the law, but it had been, he said, the one he could fully justify to himself. The others he named without embellishment and without excuse, 2 smaller robberies early on that he said he regretted, not as performances of regret but as statements of fact. She told him things in return. About growing up in Kentucky with a father who was a school teacher and a mother who was quietly formidable. About marrying Thomas Garrison at 22 because he was kind and he had a plan, and she had thought a plan was what you needed. About the 2 years in Red Rock before Thomas died and the year after, and the slow, determined process of becoming someone who did not need rescuing. On the last Friday of October, they were mending the roof of the chicken coop, and a sudden storm blew in from the west, and they were both soaked to the skin in about 30 seconds, and they climbed down from the roof and ran for the house, and she nearly slipped on the wet porch steps, and he caught her by the arm, and they ended up standing on the porch in the rain looking at each other from a distance of about 4 inches. She kissed him, or he kissed her. She was never entirely clear on who moved first, and they argued about it exactly once, much later, and reached no conclusion. What happened on that porch in the rain was the beginning of something she had not been looking for and could not stop. That was October of 1881. By November he had told her he loved her, and she had said it back, and they both understood they were saying something that created a very serious problem, because Clyde Donovan was a wanted man and could not stay in Raydrock and could not build a life here, and Edna Garrison was a woman with 40 acres and a stone farmhouse and deep, deliberate roots in a place she had bled to keep. "Come with me," he said one night, sitting at her kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup. She looked at him. "You are asking me to leave my land." "I am asking you to come with me. Those are the same thing. They do not have to be. We could go somewhere, start somewhere new." "Clyde," she said his name quietly the way she said it when she needed him to listen with his whole attention. "I have built this. I built it out of grief and hard work and pure stubbornness. I cannot leave it." He looked down at his coffee cup. "I know," he said, "but I am also not asking you to stay and get yourself arrested," she said. "I know you cannot stay." The silence that settled between them was a different kind. Heavier. Not comfortable but not hostile either. Just full of the particular sadness of a true thing that cannot be changed. "I need to clear my name," he said eventually. "The charges in 3 counties, the warrant. There is a lawyer in Santa Fe who has been building a case about the corrupt judge and the forged deeds. If the case succeeds, the railroad charges might be revisited. I have been thinking about going to testify." "That is dangerous," she said. "Yes. The men who had you charged will not want you testifying. No, they will try to stop you before you reach Santa Fe. Probably." She looked at him for a long time. "Then you need to go soon," she said, "before winter makes the roads worse." He left on the 2nd of November, 1881. She stood at her gate in the cold morning light and watched him ride away, and he turned once to look back at her, and she raised her hand, and he raised his, and then the road curved and he was gone. He wrote to her. Letters that came through a post-office box in Albuquerque that a friend of his named Ray's managed, forwarded to Raydrock under a false name. The letters were careful about specifics, never naming places or people clearly, but they told her he was alive and moving and working toward the testimony in Santa Fe. They told her other things too, small, precise, tender things that she read and reread in the evening by her lamp. She wrote back. She told him about the farm, about Raphael fixing the north fence again after a bad windstorm, about Mrs. Holt's extraordinary feud with Patterson over a disputed account, about the way the light fell across the mesa in December, about how she was fine and busy and managing well, which was true, and about how she thought about him every day, which was also true. The letters continued through the winter and into the spring of 1882, and then in May they stopped. She waited a month. She wrote twice. No response. She told herself any number of reasonable things. The postal route through Albuquerque was unreliable. Ray's might have moved. Clyde might have had to change locations quickly and not yet found a way to write. She also told herself the thing she could not dismiss, which was that a man on the run with enemies who wanted to silence him had any number of ways to disappear that did not involve a forwarding address. The summer of 1882 was the hardest summer she had spent since Thomas died. Not because the farm failed, it did not. The harvest was actually quite good. But because she was carrying something she could not put down and could not resolve, and the uncertainty of it wore at her in ways that open grief did not, because grief at least knew what it was mourning. By September she had made herself stop waiting. She put his letters in a tin box on the high shelf in her bedroom, and she got on with the business of living, and she was quite ruthlessly successful at this on most days and considerably less successful on others. She did not write again. She did not hear from him. 1 year passed, and then another, and Edna Garrison ran her farm and argued with Patterson and taught herself to manage bees because the honey was good for trading, and she mended her own roof in the summer, and she went to the church dances in the winter, and she declined 2 separate marriage proposals from men she did not love and could not pretend to. And she was, by any external measure, a capable and self-sufficient woman living a full and purposeful life. And then, on a Tuesday night in October of 1883, exactly 2 years after Clyde Donovan had ridden away from her gate, he knocked on her door. She cleaned his shoulder wound at the kitchen table, which involved cutting away the shirt and pouring whiskey into a gash that was deep but not critical, and he sat very still through it the way a person sits still when they are rationing their endurance. And when she pressed the cloth against the wound to stop the bleeding, he let out a breath through his teeth that was the only concession he made to pain. "Tell me what happened," she said. He told her. He had made it to Santa Fe. He had testified. The lawyer, a man named Connolly, had built a strong case, and the corrupt judge had been removed from his position, and the forged deeds had been invalidated by the territorial court, and the families had their land back, all of which had happened in the spring of 1882, which was why the letters had stopped. Because in the immediate aftermath of the testimony, the men he had stolen from and embarrassed had put a serious price on his head, and going anywhere near a postal route had felt like signing his own death warrant. He had spent a year moving. Colorado, then Utah, then back through Arizona, staying ahead of 3 different groups of hired men who wanted the bounty on his name. He had developed a talent for disappearing that was, he said with a grim kind of humor, one of the few genuinely useful skills he had honed in his lifetime. But the charges, she said, the warrants. Connolly filed for a review of the criminal charges on the basis of the original corruption, he said. 2 of the 3 counties dropped the charges, dismissed entirely. He looked down at his hands. The 3rd county, the one with the deputy marshal charge, that is still technically active. But the deputy himself came forward last spring and made a sworn statement that the shooting claim was false. The warrant has not been formally withdrawn, but it has been downgraded. No active pursuit. "So you are not being hunted," she said. "Not officially. The men with the bounty. The man who put up the largest portion of the bounty died in June, heart failure. His organization fell apart after that. The remaining bounty is small enough that only the most dedicated would bother, and I have been careful enough for long enough that I believe I have finally outpaced them." He met her eyes. "I spent a month on the road from Albuquerque making absolutely certain I was not followed. The men who caught up with me outside Roswell were not bounty hunters. They were cattle thieves who mistook me for someone else, and I managed to convince them of that without getting killed, though not without getting stabbed." She looked at the bandaged shoulder. Cattle thieves. Wrong place, very bad timing. She wanted to be angry at him. She had been angry at him for the better part of 2 years, in the specific complicated way you are angry at someone you love who disappears without warning and takes your sense of certainty with them. But looking at him now, sitting at her kitchen table in the lamplight with a bandaged shoulder and 2 years of road on his face, the anger could not quite find its footing. "Why did you come here?" she said. "Why not go to Santa Fe or Albuquerque, somewhere you could begin fresh without a past?" He looked at her steadily. "Because there is nothing I want in Santa Fe or Albuquerque," he said. "Because when I say I am done running, I do not only mean done running from the warrants and the hired men. I mean done running from the only place I have wanted to be since November of 1881. He paused. "I mean done running from you." Edna set down the blood-stained cloth and clasped her hands together on the table and looked at them. "You stopped writing," she said. "I know. For 17 months. I know, Edna. Do you understand what that was like? Do you have any conception of what it was like to stop hearing from you and not know whether you were alive? "I think I have some conception," he said quietly, "because I spent those 17 months knowing that I had gone silent on you and not knowing whether you had decided I was dead and moved on and found some life without me, and that thought was its own particular kind of suffering." She looked up at him. "I did not move on," she said. "I tried. I was very deliberate about trying. But no." The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense with the weight of 2 years and the particular mathematics of what they owed each other and what was still there between them despite everything. "I need you to understand something," she said finally. "I am not the same woman I was in November of 1881. I know that. I was not a small woman then, but I was more willing to accommodate uncertainty than I am now. I built something in the time you were gone, not just with the farm but with myself. I am not willing to dismantle it." "I am not asking you to," he said. "If you stay," she said, and the word "if" was doing considerable work in that sentence, "you stay on my terms. I am not a young girl swept up in a romance with an outlaw. I'm a 30-year-old woman with a farm and a livelihood and a name in this town. You would have to be honest with me, about everything, not just the convenient truths, all of it." "Yes," he said, "and we would have to be practical. You cannot stay here as a hidden secret. Sheriff Bellamy already has questions about you just from your being seen in town 2 years ago. If you stay openly, and that means we have to handle the question of your legal situation carefully and properly. Connolly is still in Santa Fe," he said. "He has already done most of the work. He told me last spring that if I came to him with documentation of the deputy's sworn statement and my full testimony about the forged deeds, he believed he could get the last warrant fully withdrawn within 3 months. Then that is what you need to do," she said. "Before anything else, you need to go to Santa Fe and finish this cleanly." He studied her face. "You are not telling me to go away," he said. "I am telling you to go to Santa Fe and come back with clean papers," she said. There is a difference. Something changed in his face then. Something that had been braced and held tight for a very long time shifted, and the storm in his eyes that she had always read as a sign of a man ready to move at any moment softened into something more like stillness. "Give me the night to rest," he said. "I will ride at first light." She stood up from the table. "There is a bed in the spare room," she said. "You know where it is." He was gone when she woke the next morning before the sun was fully up. She found a note on the kitchen table, folded once, written in his angular, economical hand. It said, "I will be back inside a month. This time you will hear from me, every week. I give you my word." She read it twice, folded it once and put it in her apron pocket and went out to see to the cows. He wrote on the 6th day, a letter from a way station south of Albuquerque, brief but definite, reporting his location and that he had made contact with Connolly in Santa Fe and that the lawyer was confident. The 3rd County's warrant was already in the process of being reviewed. She wrote back immediately to the address he had given her. He wrote on the 14th day. He had met formally with Connolly. The documentation was strong. The county prosecutor in question was a man who had succeeded the original corrupt administration and had no personal interest in maintaining the old warrant. There was a hearing scheduled. She wrote back. On the 22nd day she received 2 letters at once, apparently because one had been held up at a way station. The first was another report of progress. The second was different. The second letter said, "I have been thinking constantly about what you said, about being a 30-year-old woman who built something and will not dismantle it. You were right to say it and I was right to hear it. I want to say plainly, because I have never been good at saying the plain thing when it is the tender thing, that what I feel for you has not diminished by a single degree in 2 years of silence and running. If anything, the running clarified it. You were the fixed point. Every road eventually pointed back to you. I know that is a great deal to put in a letter and not enough to put in a letter at the same time, but I am trying to say what is true." Edna read that letter at her kitchen table in the November morning light and felt the careful architecture of her carefully managed composure develop several significant cracks. She wrote back a long letter, the longest she had ever written him. She said things she had not said before because she had not needed to when they were together, and then had not been able to when they were apart. And writing them now felt like opening a window that had been stuck shut for too long. On the 28th day the letter came. The warrant had been fully and formally withdrawn. Clyde Donovan's name was clear in all 4 counties. There were no active warrants, no outstanding charges, no legal impediment to him living openly in any part of New Mexico territory. He was coming home. The word home was his, and she read it in his letter and held it in her mind like something she needed to examine carefully from multiple angles. He rode up to her gate on the 30th day of November, 1883, on a different horse than the one he had left on, a good bay mare he had bought in Santa Fe. He had new clothes that actually fit him, and he had shaved, and he looked, she thought, watching him from the porch where she was standing with her arms folded against the cold, like a man who had set down a weight he had been carrying for so long he had forgotten what it felt like not to carry it. She came down the porch steps and went to the gate, and he dismounted, and they stood on either side of the gate for a moment, and she thought it was a fitting image, the gate between them, because there was still the question of what she was going to open and what she was going to keep latched. "Show me the papers," she said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document. She read it carefully. It was official. The county of Dona Ana, the last outstanding jurisdiction, had formally cleared all charges. It bore the seal and signature of the county prosecutor and a territorial judge. She folded it and handed it back and looked at him. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would. You also told me you would keep writing, and then you went 17 months silent," she said. "I did. And I am not going to tell you it was unavoidable or make excuses for it, because the truth is more complicated than that, and you deserve the complicated truth." He met her eyes. "There were weeks when I could have written, when a route was available. I did not write in those weeks because I was afraid that if I wrote, you would write back, and if you wrote back, I would read in your letter that you had built something good without me, and I could not bear the thought of being the disruption that unmade it." She looked at him for a long moment. "So your silence was partly cowardice," she said. "Yes," he said, "I will own that." "I appreciate that," she said. "I appreciate you owning it." She reached forward and unlatched the gate. "Come inside," she said. "There is coffee. And we need to talk about practical things." He came inside. They talked about practical things. The practical things included where he would live, which could not immediately be with her because the town's opinion of her mattered to her ability to do business, and she had a reputation to maintain. He agreed completely and without argument, which surprised her. He suggested that he might look into whether there was work in Raydrock or the surrounding area, something legitimate, something he could be seen doing openly. He had skills with horses and cattle. There was a ranch north of town, the Alcott Spread, that had been looking for a capable hand all autumn because their foreman had broken his leg in September and was not expected to work again. He could inquire there. She said she thought that was a sound idea. He said he would take a room at Mrs. Holt's boarding house again, if she had space. He said he would present himself to Sheriff Bellamy with his papers and make clear from the first moment that he had no outstanding legal issues and no concealed purpose in Raydrock. She said that was also sound, and that Sheriff Bellamy was a reasonable man who would appreciate the directness. They talked for 2 hours, and the coffee pot emptied, and she made more, and they talked some more. And it was not until he stood up to leave, because it was late afternoon and he needed to stable the horse and find Mrs. Holt before dark, that they stopped talking about practical things. He stood at the kitchen door with his hat in his hand, and he said, "Edna." And she said, "Yes." And he said, "I need to know if there is any possibility. I am not asking you to commit to anything tonight. I am asking if the possibility exists." She looked at him standing in her kitchen doorway with his hat in his hand, this man who had broken her heart by going silent and had pieced it back together by coming back, this wanted man who was no longer wanted, this outlaw who was no longer an outlaw, who had walked through her door 2 weeks ago bleeding and exhausted and looking at her with the eyes of a man who had run out of road. "There is a possibility," she said. "There may even be more than a possibility. But I need time to know the current version of you. We have both changed." He nodded. "I have the same need," he said. 2 years changes a person." "Then we go slowly," she said. "As slowly as you need," he said. He put on his hat and he went to find Mrs. Holt, and Edna stood in her kitchen for a long time after the sound of his horse had faded and felt the particular, terrifying, wonderful feeling of a door opening again that she had thought was permanently shut. The winter of 1883 and into 1884 was the period of Reconstruction. Clyde got the position at the Alcott Ranch inside a week, because he knew horses in the way that very few people know horses, and old Mr. Alcott recognized it immediately. He presented himself to Sheriff Bellamy on the second day with his papers, and Bellamy read them carefully and looked at him over the papers and said that he had heard the name and that he was glad the matters were resolved, and that he expected Redrock to find him quiet and law-abiding. And Clyde said that was his full intention, and Bellamy said good, and that was more or less the end of it. Mrs. Holt charged him fair rent and fed him breakfast and did not ask him any impertinent questions, which he appreciated. He and Edna saw each other several times a week. Sometimes he came to the farm after his day's work at the Alcott Ranch to help with heavier tasks she had deferred, because they required more than one person. Sometimes she came to town on errands and they met at Patterson's store or the post office and walked back together along the South Road. On Sundays, when the minister was in residence, they attended the same service and sat in adjacent pews, which the town noted and discussed with considerable enthusiasm. They were relearning each other. The process had a delicacy to it that neither of them acknowledged directly, but that both of them observed carefully. He had grown quieter in 2 years, more deliberate. She had grown firmer in her sense of herself, less inclined to soften her edges for other people's comfort. These changes, when they encountered them, did not conflict, but rather complemented each other in interesting ways. They argued because they had always argued, and it was still good and exhausting and satisfying. They argued about the proper management of livestock, and about the territorial legislature, and about whether a certain book Edna had borrowed from the minister's library was brilliant or infuriating. And Clyde said both, and Edna said you cannot have both, and Clyde said, why not, and Edna eventually conceded that perhaps you could. He made her laugh. That was the thing she had not been sure would still be true, and it was still true. And the first time he said something that made her laugh genuinely and fully in that cold December morning outside the livery stable, she felt something in her chest make a sound like a key turning in a lock. He kissed her for the first time since his return on the last day of January, 1884. It was after Sunday service and they were walking back along the South Road, and the sky was that particular pale winter blue that New Mexico does better than anywhere else. And he stopped walking and looked at her and said, "May I?" And she said yes. And it was careful and warm and everything that had been stored up without an outlet for 2 years, and she stood in the cold January road and held his face in her mittened hands and thought clearly, yes, this is still the thing. He pulled back and looked at her and said, "I am sorry it took me this long to ask." "You asked at the right time," she said. "Earlier would have been premature." By March he was no longer sleeping at Mrs. Holt's. This was the subject of considerable town discussion, but considerably less town disapproval than Edna had braced for, partly because she was liked and respected in Redrock, and partly because Clyde had, in 4 months of quiet work and lawful living, built himself a reputation as a dependable and decent man, and partly because the older women in town who had the most influence on these matters took a private vote and decided that Edna Garrison, who had been alone long enough and had managed that aloneness with more dignity than most people managed comfort, deserved her happiness, and they would not be the ones to begrudge it her. Mrs. Holt, who had watched the whole trajectory of it, said simply that it was about time, which was the highest endorsement available from that quarter. He moved into the spare room officially in late March, and the arrangement was practical and separate, and within the bounds of what could be defended publicly, which mattered. And it was also increasingly clear to both of them that the spare room arrangement was a formality that neither of them believed would last indefinitely. It was Edna who said the thing first. In April, sitting on the porch in the cool evening with the smell of apple blossom coming from the 2 trees Thomas had planted in the side yard before he died. "I think we should get married," she said. Clyde, who had been mending a harness, went still. "I am not asking you to propose to me," she said. "I am saying I think it is the right thing and we should discuss it like the practical adults we both claim to be." He set down the harness and looked at her. "You are the most remarkable woman I have ever known," he said. "That is not a response to my statement," she said, though she was pleased. "It is a related statement," he said. "I have been thinking about the same thing and trying to work out the right way to raise it, and you have just done it more efficiently than I was going to." "So you agree," she said. "I agree completely," he said. "I want to marry you. I want to marry you in a church in front of everyone in this town so that there is no ambiguity about my intentions or my commitment." "Good," she said. "Then we will arrange it." They were married on the 14th of June, 1884, by the minister who had once come to warn Edna about Clyde Donovan. And if that minister found any irony in the situation, he kept it to himself, possibly because Edna Garrison had always been one of his more formidable parishioners, and he was not fool enough to voice it. The wedding was a full church event with more of Redrock in attendance than Edna had expected, and Mrs. Holt cried from the 3rd pew, and Raphael, who was 17 now and who had been working the farm with Edna for 5 years, stood straight and proud by the gate when they came home, having decorated the fence with wildflowers. Patterson came to the reception at the church hall and behaved himself, which was its own minor miracle. Sheriff Bellamy shook Clyde's hand and said that he was glad things had worked out, and that he hoped to continue finding Clyde unremarkable from a law enforcement standpoint. Clyde said that was his devoted intention. That summer was the summer Edna had not known she was waiting for. Not because she had been unhappy before, she had been building and managing and living with purpose, but because there is a difference between a life that works and a life that is full. And what she felt in those long June evenings on the porch with Clyde beside her and the mesas going gold in the last light was the particular warmth of fullness. He was good with the farm. He had always been capable, but now he brought that capability to bear with the ownership of a man who was investing in something of his own, and the 40 acres responded to the increased attention. They talked about expanding, about whether to take on more livestock or develop the irrigation on the east end where the soil was deep and water could be brought from the creek by a channel Thomas had started digging and never finished. Clyde finished it over the summer, a long project that took most of July and August, and involved Raphael and 2 men from the Alcott Ranch who came to help on their days off. When the channel was finished and the first water ran through it and began to spread across the dry east end, Edna stood and watched it and felt something that was not just satisfaction but a kind of vindication. Thomas had dreamed it. She had maintained the possibility of it. Clyde had finished it. The land did not know or care about any of that. It simply took the water and began to live differently. But she cared, and the feeling it gave her was one she held close. In November of 1884, she told Clyde she was expecting. He was at the table when she told him, eating his breakfast before the day's work, and she sat down across from him and said it plainly, which was her way. He set down his fork and looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was layered in ways she took her time reading. There was joy in it, clear and immediate. There was also something more careful, something that looked like it was taking the measure of a responsibility. "How do you feel?" he said. "I feel well," she said. "I'm not worried about the physical aspect of it. Women in this territory deliver healthy babies in considerably more difficult circumstances than mine. And otherwise, he said, how do you feel otherwise? She considered the question with the honesty it deserved. I feel ready, she said. I did not know until this moment whether I would feel ready, but I do. He reached across the table and took her hand. I am going to be a different kind of father than mine was, he said. It was a simple statement, and it was also the most important thing he had said to her since the night he appeared on her porch bleeding and asking to stay. I know that, she said. I want to be sure you know that. Clyde, she held his hand tighter. I have been watching you for 3.5 years with an interruption I am choosing to set aside. I know what kind of man you are. He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed it there for a moment, and his eyes above their joined hands were very bright. Well then, he said, we had better make sure the East Channel can support the extra weight of a farm family that is about to get larger. She laughed, and he smiled at her over her hand. And outside the window the New Mexico morning was spreading itself across the mesas in long bars of gold and pink. And the world was very good and very specific and very real. The pregnancy proceeded without serious difficulty, though the winter of 1884 to 1885 was cold enough to be challenging, and Edna spent more time indoors than she would have preferred. Clyde managed the outdoor work with Raphael and checked on her with a consistency that she told him twice was verging on excessive, and that she privately found extremely touching. Mrs. Holt came to call regularly with advice and provisions. Dr. Waverly, the town's physician, who also served the surrounding 40 miles of territory, made 2 visits in the winter months and pronounced everything satisfactory. In the evenings they sat by the stove and Clyde read aloud while Edna worked at things with her hands, mending or darning or, increasingly, sewing the small practical garments a baby requires. He read Hawthorne and Dickens, and at her request, a recent novel by Henry James that they argued about so extensively and with such genuine energy that they were still arguing about it when the baby arrived. The baby arrived on the 23rd of March, 1885, with Dr. Waverly attending and Mrs. Holt present as support and Clyde pacing the kitchen floor in a state that he refused to characterize as anxiety, because he said he was simply making sure the fire was adequately stoked at regular intervals, which was transparently false but which Mrs. Holt allowed him because she was a compassionate woman. The baby was a boy. He was red-faced and loud and absolutely healthy, and when Dr. Waverly carried him out to the kitchen and placed him in Clyde's arms, Clyde went completely still in the way he went still when something had struck him at a depth that bypassed his considerable capacity for composure. He stood in the kitchen of the stone farmhouse that Thomas Garrison had built and that Edna Garrison had kept, and that they had made together into something warm and permanent, and he held his son with a care so exact it was like watching a man handle something irreplaceable, and he said nothing for a long time. Edna, recovering in the bedroom, asked Mrs. Holt what Clyde was doing. Mrs. Holt looked into the kitchen and then looked back at Edna and said, "He is standing very still and looking at that child like the whole world just reorganized itself around a new center of gravity." "Good," said Edna and closed her eyes. They named the boy James Thomas Donovan. James because Edna had a brother named James who had died young and whom she had loved. Thomas because it was right and proper to honor the man who had built the house and dug the beginning of the channel and had been kind, and because Edna believed that love was not a finite resource that depleted when you loved more than one person, and Clyde agreed with this entirely and without qualification. James Thomas was, from the first weeks, an extremely opinionated baby. He had views on feeding schedules and sleeping arrangements, and the appropriate response to any situation he found unsatisfactory, and these views were expressed at considerable volume and with remarkable consistency. Clyde, who had never spent substantial time around infants, adapted to this reality with a pragmatism that Edna found both impressive and amusing. He learned quickly what the baby needed, and he provided it without fuss, and without the vague discomfort that some men brought to the early months of their children's lives. She watched him with the baby in the evenings, the way he walked the boy when he was fretful, talking to him in the low, steady voice he used with horses. And she thought about the boy in Missouri with the drunkard father, and what it cost a person to decide to be different from what they were shown, and how much that decision was worth. "You are doing very well," she told him one night. "He is a straightforward person," Clyde said, adjusting James against his chest. "He knows what he wants and he says so. I can respect that." "He gets it from his mother," Edna said. "Yes," Clyde said, "he does, and that is nothing but a good thing." The spring of 1885 brought new energy to the farm. The East Channel irrigation expanded the productive acreage significantly, and Edna, recovering fully from the birth by late April, threw herself back into the work with all her characteristic intensity. They hired a second hand alongside Raphael, a quiet man named Graves from a family that had been farming the territory for 2 generations, and the farm began to look like what Thomas had dreamed, and what Edna had maintained the bones of through sheer will. Clyde left the Alcott ranch in May. He had given Mr. Alcott notice in March, and Alcott had been sorry to lose him but understood, because the Donovan farm, as it was coming to be known in Red Rock, clearly needed its owner's full attention. Clyde spent the summer working the land with the same focused intelligence he brought to everything, and the results were visible by August. Red Rock, which had observed the Donovan situation with its usual thorough interest, made its collective judgment by the end of the first year of their marriage. The judgment was favorable. Clyde Donovan was known as a hard worker, a fair dealer, a quiet but reliable presence at community matters, and a man who could be counted on if your fence needed mending or your horse needed a knowledgeable eye. The dark past that the minister had brought to Edna's door in October of 1881 was known in the vague way that people know things in small towns, but it had been superseded by the present reality, and the territory was a place where a man's current conduct weighed more heavily than his former reputation. Sheriff Bellamy, who was a careful man, spent the first 6 months watching Clyde Donovan with the professional attention of someone who has been around long enough to know that change is possible but not guaranteed. By the end of those 6 months, he had satisfied himself that the change was real, and he said so to Edna when he met her in Patterson's store one afternoon. "I want you to know that I have formed a good opinion of your husband," he said, in the direct, economical way of a man who does not use 5 words when 3 will do. "I thought you might like to hear that." "I appreciate it, Sheriff," she said, "though I formed my own opinion some years ago." "Yes," he said, "you were ahead of me on that one." The summer of 1885 brought an unexpected thing. A letter arrived from Missouri addressed to Clyde Donovan at the Red Rock post office. It was from a woman named Ellen Croft, who identified herself as the sister of the man whose farm had been taken by the forged deed, the man Clyde had known from childhood. She wrote to tell him that the family's land had been restored and that they were working it again, and that her brother had asked her to write because he could not write easily himself, having had little schooling, but that he wanted Clyde to know that the debt was considered paid, and that whatever Clyde had done in the years since, the family remembered what he had done for them, and they were grateful. Clyde read the letter twice at the kitchen table and then folded it and set it down and was quiet for a while. Edna, who was nursing James at the other end of the table, watched him. "Good news," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. He picked up the letter again and looked at it. "The thing that started all of it, the reason for the robbery, the warrants, the running, it came out right." "It came out right," she agreed. He looked at her. "I am glad I did it," he said. "Even knowing what it cost, I would do it again." "I know you would," she said. "That is one of the things I know about you." He folded the letter carefully and put it in his coat pocket, and then he looked at his son nursing, and his wife watching him, and the afternoon light coming through the kitchen window at its familiar afternoon angle. And something in the set of his face, was very quiet in the way of a person who has found their exact right place. The years moved as years do in a life that is full, quickly and richly, and with the texture of real living. James Thomas, who was stubborn and curious and very loud, grew from infancy to toddlerhood and began to develop a personality that caused Edna to look at Clyde with an expression of wry recognition. He had his father's eyes and his mother's absolute certainty about his own opinions, which was a formidable combination. In the autumn of 1886, Edna told Clyde she was expecting again. This pregnancy was more demanding than the first. She was 33, and the work of the farm was heavier than it had been, and the second months were marked by an exhaustion that she managed with her usual determination, but that Clyde and Raphael and Graves managed around her with a delicacy that she was grateful for and also slightly impatient with. The baby arrived in April of 1887 and was a girl, which delighted James, who was 2 years old and whose reaction to his sister was a proprietorial affection that expressed itself primarily in watching her with enormous eyes from a safe distance, and occasionally bringing her objects he considered valuable, including a smooth stone he had found at the creek and a piece of broken harness buckle. They named her Clara Ruth Donovan. Clara because it was a name Edna had always loved, and Ruth because it suited her, even at the very beginning, even before she had done anything to suggest the particular calm steadiness she would eventually grow into. 2 children and a working farm and a marriage that had been built on honesty and argument and the specific deep warmth of 2 people who had chosen each other with full knowledge of the costs. That was the shape of the life. But life does not maintain a single shape. It pushes against its own edges. In the fall of 1887, a man rode into Raydrock who knew Clyde Donovan from the old days. His name was Sewell, and he was not a good man. He had ridden with a gang in Colorado in 1882 that had intersected briefly with Clyde's life on the run, and he had memories of that intersection that he was not careful enough about keeping to himself. He started talking in the Dusty Boot Saloon. He talked about the old warrants, which were no longer valid, and he talked about the railroad robbery, which was legally resolved, and he talked about the things that had happened in Colorado in 1882 with the wrong kind of emphasis, the kind that was designed to smear rather than inform. Edna heard about it from Mrs. Holt, who heard about it from the barber, and she told Clyde the same evening with her full account of what had been said. Clyde listened to the account without visible reaction, and when she finished he said, "What do you want me to do?" She looked at him. This was not the response she had expected. "I expected you to tell me what you intended to do," she said. "This affects your life and your standing in this town as much as mine," he said. "Possibly more. What do you want me to do?" She thought about it seriously for a moment. "I want you to go to Sheriff Bellamy," she said. "Directly and first, before Sewell has another night to talk. You give Bellamy the full account yourself, your version, your documentation. You do not let Sewell's version settle into the air before you put your own words there." "Yes," he said. "That is right." "And I am coming with you," she said. "I know," he said. They went to Bellamy the next morning together, with the documentation from Connolly, and with Edna's clear and direct account of the man's claims and their basis in facts that were either distorted or resolved. Bellamy listened to everything and asked several precise questions, and then said that he was aware of Sewell, who had been in Raydrock 3 days and had already managed to create 2 separate disputes at the Dusty Boot, and that he would handle the matter. He handled it. Sewell left Raydrock by sundown of the same day, not under any legal compulsion but under the kind of very clear social pressure that a respected sheriff in a small town can bring to bear when he is determined and when the town is behind him. The town was behind him because the town was behind the Donovans. Patterson came to Edna the next day and said, in the grudging, sideways way he had of expressing anything that was not a business transaction, that he had told Sewell what he thought of people who came into a town and poisoned the well, and that he hoped the matter was resolved. Edna thanked him and bought a larger quantity of cornmeal than she strictly needed as a gesture of goodwill. The attempted destabilization failed completely. If anything, it made the town's feeling about Clyde Donovan firmer, because there is nothing that consolidates a community's opinion of a person like seeing that person face trouble with transparency and integrity. Raphael, who was 21 now and who had been with Edna since he was 12 and who understood her better than almost anyone, told Clyde privately, while they were working the East Fields one October morning, that he had known from the beginning that Clyde Donovan was the right kind of person. Clyde said, "You knew me for about 2 weeks before I left the first time. How could you have known?" Raphael said, "You talked to me like I was worth talking to. That tells you a great deal about a person." Clyde thought about that for a while. "Your opinion means a good deal to me," he said. "I want you to know that." "I know," said Raphael, and they went back to work. The years continued to move and fill and build. James Thomas grew into a boy who was everywhere at once, who asked questions about everything with a relentlessness that occasionally exhausted even Clyde, which Edna found deeply satisfying, and who had a particular gift with animals that showed up when he was about 4 and only strengthened from there. Clara Ruth was quieter and more observant and had her father's habit of choosing words carefully, which she showed even as a small child by waiting until she had something worth saying before she opened her mouth. In the spring of 1889, Edna told Clyde she was expecting a third time. "We are building quite a household," he said. "We are building what we are building," she said. "I would not have it different." "Nor would I," he said. "Not by a single degree." The third child came in October of 1889, another boy, whom they named Henry Reyes Donovan, the middle name for the man in Albuquerque who had forwarded Clyde's letters during the years of running, and who had never been asked to explain or justify that loyalty. They sent Reyes a letter when the boy was born, and received a response full of such genuine warmth that Edna read it aloud at dinner, and James Thomas wanted to know who this man was, and when they could visit him, which was a question they took seriously and eventually answered by making the journey to Albuquerque the following summer. The visit to Reyes was itself a memorable thing. He was a middle-aged man with a warm household and 3 children of his own, and a wife named Carmela, who fed them with the kind of abundant generosity that makes you understand immediately what kind of people you are dealing with. Clyde and Reyes sat on the porch in the Albuquerque evening and talked for a long time while Edna and Carmela managed the combined chaos of 5 children, and found, to no one's surprise, that they had a great deal to say to each other. James, who was 5, found a particular friend in Reyes's eldest, a boy of 6 named Marco, and the two of them spent 2 days creating a complex civilization in the backyard, using sticks and rocks and a remarkable amount of mud, and arrived at every mealtime in a state that caused their respective mothers to exchange the specific look of 2 women who understand each other perfectly. On the way home from Albuquerque, Clyde and Edna rode with the sleeping children in the wagon bed behind them, and the desert evening was enormous and clear and full of stars, and Edna leaned her head against Clyde's shoulder. "I am glad we went," she said. "So am I," he said. He put his arm around her. "Reyes has been a fixed point for me for a long time. It was right to let the children know him." "It was right," she agreed. They rode for a while in comfortable silence. "I have been thinking," she said eventually. "You are always thinking," he said. "This is not news." "I have been thinking about the East Channel and whether we could extend it another 1/4 mile and take on the additional acreage on the far side of the property line," she said. "The Mulray family that owned that strip has been talking about selling since their son moved to Denver." "How much are they asking?" he said. "Bellamy says they are asking $250 for the strip, but that they would take $200 if the buyer was someone they trusted." Clyde thought about it. "We have the capital," he said. "The last 2 harvests have been good." "I know," she said. "I think we should do it. I think we should buy the strip and extend the channel and put in wheat on the far end. The soil there is better than ours." "When did you speak with Bellamy about this?" "Last Thursday at the post office." "You have already decided," he said, without any edge to it. "I had almost decided," she said. "I wanted your view." "My view is that you are right and we should buy the strip," he said. "Good," she said. "That is my view also." They bought the strip from the Mulray family in October of 1890, and the extension of the channel took most of the following spring. And by the summer of 1890, the wheat was in the ground on the far end, and the farm was 40 acres larger and considerably more productive than it had been in any previous year. Raphael, who had been farming with Edna since boyhood and who had absorbed everything there was to know about this particular piece of land, took on more formal oversight of the East End, while Clyde managed the livestock side, and Edna managed the accounts and the trade relationships with the buyers in Reed Rock and further afield. James Thomas, who was 6, followed his father around the livestock side of the operation with a dog-like devotion and an unending supply of questions, and Clyde answered every one of them with the patient thoroughness of a man who believes that questions deserve real answers. Clara Ruth, who was 4, had decided that the bees were her particular domain, and Edna, who had taught herself beekeeping years ago, now taught her daughter with the same methodical care she brought to everything. There was a morning in July when Edna stood back and watched Clara Ruth, small and entirely calm in her child-sized protective veil, check a frame with hands that did not shake, and felt a pride so physical it was almost painful. Henry was 2 and entirely ungovernable and deeply beloved. That autumn, Edna and Clyde sat on the porch in the October evening, as they had sat on that porch on so many evenings, and looked at the farm in the last light, and Edna thought about all the evenings she had sat on this same porch alone and what she had carried alone, and what it meant to no longer carry it alone. "Do you ever regret coming back?" she said. Not from anxiety but from genuine curiosity, and because she believed in asking the real questions. Clyde was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was giving a question its full due. "No," he said, "not for a single day. Not even on the days when James asks you 200 questions before breakfast and Henry has disassembled something he should not have disassembled. Especially not on those days," he said. He looked at the mesa going dark in the distance. "I spent a long time not knowing what I was running toward. I knew what I was running from, but the toward part was unclear." He turned to look at her. "It is not unclear anymore." She met his eyes in the October dusk. "No," she said, "it is not." She took his hand on the arm of the rocking chair, and they sat in the cooling evening with the sound of the children inside, and the farm settling around them into its night sounds, and the stars beginning to come out above the mesa. The Donovan farm went on building itself, season by season and year by year, and the family went on building itself in the same way. In 1892, James Thomas turned 7 and began attending the school in Reed Rock, a development he approached with the same aggressive curiosity he brought to everything, to the considerable entertainment of his teacher, a young woman named Miss Pauley, who wrote Edna a note after the first week saying that James was the most intellectually energetic student she had encountered in her career, and that she was looking forward to the school year with genuine excitement and only slightly mixed feelings. Clara Ruth began school the following year at 5, and Miss Pauley's note after that first week said simply that James's sister was going to run the territory someday, and she meant it as a compliment. Henry proved, as he grew, to have a gift for mechanical things that neither of his parents could fully account for, but that both of them recognized as real and valuable. By the time he was 4, he was taking apart and reassembling any mechanical device he could get his hands on, and the farm's tools and equipment were simultaneously better maintained and more frequently disassembled than they had ever been. In 1893, Raphael married a woman named Maria from a ranching family 20 miles to the east, and the wedding was held at the Donovan farm by their request and Edna's enthusiastic agreement, and it was a celebration that Reed Rock talked about for the better part of a year. Clyde built a long table in the yard, and every person in the town who wanted to come, came. And there was food and music and dancing, and the particular happiness of a community celebrating its own best people. Edna danced with Clyde for the first time at Raphael's wedding, which sounds strange for a couple 8 years married, but which had simply never arisen before because they had not attended events where dancing was the thing. They were not practiced dancers. What they were was people who had spent 8 years learning the physical grammar of each other's presence, and dancing turned out to require the same thing. They managed 2 songs before James, who was 8 and deeply embarrassed by the display, came to drag them apart with an urgency that made the surrounding adults laugh, and they let themselves be dragged and stood with their son between them and watched Raphael and Maria dance. And the evening was warm and full of lantern light, and the smell of dry grass and summer. In 1895, Clyde received a letter from Connolly in Santa Fe. Connolly had been appointed to the territorial bench, a significant advancement, and his letter to Clyde was partly to share that news and partly to say that in looking back over his case files, he wanted Clyde to know that the Donovan case had been, in his view, one of the clearest examples in his career of justice, eventually arriving where it was supposed to go, and that he thought about it with satisfaction. Clyde wrote back a letter of congratulations and genuine warmth, and Edna read it over his shoulder and said that it was a good letter and that it said the right things. "You always know when a thing says the right things," Clyde said. "I read a great deal," she said. "I have opinions about language." "You have opinions about everything," he said. "Yes," she said, "and you have always let me hold them." He turned in his chair to look at her. "Your opinions are among the best things about you," he said. "That is not a small statement given the competition." She smiled at him, the full open smile that she did not deploy casually but that when it came was like a door swinging wide. "Write your letter," she said. "Connolly is waiting." The years moved on. The farm grew and settled into its mature form. James Thomas, at 12, was already a serious student of everything his father knew about horses and livestock, and was beginning to talk about veterinary work with the focused intensity that told both his parents it was a real ambition rather than a passing interest. Clara Ruth, at 10, had taken on the bees entirely, and was also teaching herself to keep accounts by going through Edna's ledgers with a systematic attention that made Edna want to both laugh and sit down with her for 3 hours. Henry was 8 and had decided that he wanted to understand how machinery worked at the level of its fundamental principles, which meant he was reading everything he could find on mechanics and engineering, which meant Edna was ordering books from the publisher in Denver every 2 or 3 months. In 1896, Edna told Clyde she was expecting again. "We have done this before," she said. "We know how. We are good at it," he agreed. "Or rather, you are good at it." "I am present and supportive." "That is more than adequate," she said. She was 42 years old and she was aware this was different from 29 or 33. Dr. Waverly, who was older now himself and had the quiet authority of someone who had delivered half the children in the territory, told her to rest more than she had with the others and to let the farm manage without her for the 3rd trimester. Edna's interpretation of rest more was somewhat flexible, but she did slow down, genuinely, and let Clyde and Raphael and Graves carry more of the physical weight, and spent the evenings on the porch rather than going back out after dinner as she sometimes did in busier seasons. On those evenings, Clyde sat beside her and they talked, the long good conversation of 2 people who have been each other's primary company for 12 years and who have not run out of things to say. They talked about the children and the farm and the territory and the books they were reading and the people they knew and the things they thought about the world. On one such evening in the late autumn, she asked him something she had never quite asked directly. "If you could go back to the moment before the railroad robbery," she said, "if you knew what it would cost, would you still do it?" He considered it carefully in the dark. "I have thought about that question many times," he said. "The honest answer is complicated. That is why I am asking," she said. If I could know then what it would cost in terms of years and running and the harm of my own absence, I think I might have found another way to help those families," he said. "Not because the robbery was wrong in itself, but because there are costs you do not think about when you are 26 and angry and certain. The cost to other people who end up inside the blast radius of your choices." He paused. "But if I had not done it, I would not have been in Redrock. And if I had not been in Redrock, I would not have walked into Patterson's store and stood behind a woman who told me she had a farm on the South Road." "That is a sentimental calculation," she said. "Yes," he said, "I am capable of sentiment." "I know," she said. "It is one of your better-kept secrets." He laughed quietly in the dark, and she leaned against him, and they sat in the November cold with the blanket over them both and listened to the specific silence of the farm at night, which was not actually silence at all but a layered, textured quiet full of wind and animals, and the distant sound of Redrock 3 miles north. And it was absolutely their particular world, built from what they had each brought to it and what they had built together, and it was whole. The baby came in February of 1897, another boy. They named him Walter James Donovan. Walter because Edna had read a biography of Sir Walter Scott that winter and found herself deeply moved by it, and James for the brother Edna had lost, the name she had already given once and found she wanted to give again in a new form. Walter was from the first days a sunny and equable baby who seemed to have decided that life was a satisfactory arrangement, and he would meet it on those terms. Clara Ruth, who was 10, appointed herself his co-guardian and took the role with the seriousness she brought to all things. Henry, who was 9, was fascinated by the baby as a mechanical problem. How did he function? What were his inputs and outputs? What would he eventually be capable of? James Thomas, who was 12, was kind and a little awkward with his new brother in the way of a boy who is not sure yet how to be tender in front of people, but who was reliably there when the baby needed carrying or soothing at odd hours. In the years that followed, the Donovan farm became something more than what it had started as. It became, in the language the territory used for such things, a going concern. The extended acreage, the irrigation channel, the wheat on the east end, the livestock operation that Clyde and James Thomas developed together. Raphael, who had his own family now, remained a partner in the operation in all but name. Graves retired in 1898, and they hired 2 new hands, brothers named Farrow, who were capable and dependable and who stayed for years. Redrock grew a little in those years, the way small towns do when the territory around them is productive. A second general store opened, which Patterson took as a personal affront, and which resulted in slightly better quality and pricing at Patterson's original establishment, which the town accepted as a benefit of competition. A proper school building was constructed in 1897, replacing the rented room the school had operated from, and the opening of it was a community event that Edna helped organize and that drew people from 20 miles in every direction. Edna Donovan, as she was known now, sat on the new school's organizing committee with the same energy she brought to everything. Sheriff Bellamy, who served until 1899 before retiring on good terms, once remarked to a younger deputy that Edna Donovan was probably the most capable person in the county, at which the deputy, who did not know her well yet, made the mistake of expressing surprise, and Bellamy looked at him and said nothing, and the deputy understood that the remark had been a statement of observable fact. The year 1900 arrived, and with it, a new century, which Redrock marked with a celebration that was partly civic and partly just a good excuse for a party, the kind that towns in the territory held when they could find a reason. The Donovans attended, the whole family, all 6 of them, which Edna organized with the logistical precision she applied to everything. James Thomas was 15 and almost as tall as his father and deeply interested in a girl named Ada from the next ranch, which he was managing with all the self-conscious intensity of a 15-year-old who will not admit what is obvious. Clara Ruth was 13, and had the beehives producing at a quantity that had created a small secondary trade operation in honey. Henry was 11 and had recently found a copy of a book about electrical mechanics that had effectively taken over his entire existence. Walter, who was 3, had settled firmly into the role of the family's most cheerful member, and had recently acquired the ability to make James Thomas laugh regardless of how aggressively James was pretending to be too mature for the sort of things Walter found funny. On the evening of the last day of 1899, with the new century a few hours away, Edna and Clyde sat on the porch in the cold, blankets around them, the children inside by the stove. 47, she said. 48 in March, he corrected. I was not asking, I was noting. I know, he said, 47 and completely unreasonable about it. I am entirely reasonable about it, she said. I am simply noting that we are both older than we were. Considerably older than when you kissed me on this porch in the rain in October of 1881, he said. You kissed me. We have been over this. The matter is unresolved. I kissed you, she said. I know because I remember deciding to do it. I remember leaning in. You leaned in after I started moving, she said. The chronology is disputed. She laughed, and he smiled at her, and outside the stars were very bright over the mesa, and the new century was coming in cold and dark and full of possibility, and the farm was asleep, and the children were warm inside, and the life they had built together on the bones of something broken and dangerous and forbidden and deeply worth the cost was all around them. What do you want? She said. From the new century. He thought about it. I want to watch our children grow into people who have what they need, he said. I want the farm to keep working. I want to be here in this specific place with you for as many years as there are available to me. He looked at her. And I want you to tell me once clearly that you do not regret it, any of it. The whole particular sequence of events that started with a door opened at 10:30 on a Tuesday night. She looked at him in the new century's first cold hours. Clyde, she said, I opened that door for a reason. I have never for one single day regretted what came through it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he put his arm around her and pulled her close against the cold, and they sat under the stars and watched the old century become the new one, and the land around them was dark and quiet and theirs, absolutely and completely theirs. Inside, Walter woke up and made a noise, and Clara Ruth went to him before either of her parents had to get up, and they heard the small sounds of their daughter settling their youngest and the house going quiet again. She is going to run the territory someday, Clyde said. Miss Polly was right. They all are, Edna said, each in their own particular way. Yes, he said, they are. The farm went on. The family went on. James Thomas went on to become a veterinarian, traveling from Redrock with his doctor's bag and his father's knowledge of animals and his mother's ironclad competence. And he married Ada when they were both 22, which surprised precisely no one in the territory who had watched them since they were 15. Clara Ruth took over the full business side of the Donovan farm when she was 17, and Edna was ready to hand it over. And she ran it with a precision and intelligence that turned the operation from a good farm into a genuinely significant agricultural concern by the time she was 20. She did not marry until she was 25, to a lawyer from Santa Fe who had the good sense to understand that he was marrying a woman of considerable independent capability and who was glad of it, and she kept her own name alongside his, which the territory found interesting and Clara Ruth found entirely obvious. Henry went east. There was no farm-shaped life for Henry, because Henry's world was in wires and engines, and the extraordinary unfolding world of electrical mechanics that the new century was revealing. He went to a technical school in Denver at 16 and then further east, and he came back for holidays and for important moments, and he wrote letters that kept them up to the minute on his latest thinking, and he was happy in the way a person is happy when they are doing exactly the thing they were built to do. Walter, the youngest, turned out to be the most like Edna in temperament and the most like Clyde in manner, which was an interesting combination. He was methodical, stubborn, fair, and had an absolute instinct for people. He worked the farm alongside Raphael's sons when he was old enough, and he sat on the school committee in Reed Rock when he was 25, just as his mother had, and he showed early signs of having views on the management of the territory's water rights that were going to make him a considerable figure in the years ahead. In 1905, the year Walter turned 8 and James Thomas turned 20, Edna and Clyde sat on the same porch on a June evening, and the farm was in full summer operation around them, and the apple trees in the side yard, Thomas Garrison's apple trees, were heavy with early fruit. Clyde was 52 and looked it, in the particular good way that a man who has worked outdoors his whole life and been well-fed and genuinely loved looks it. His dark hair had gone silver at the temples, and the lines on his face were deep and comfortable and entirely his. He had his boots off and his feet up on the porch rail, which was his preferred posture for evenings. Edna was 52 as well and had not lost a single degree of herself to the years, though she had distributed herself differently, the farm in Clara Ruth's capable hands and her own attention freer to move where it wanted, which it was currently directing at a book of American poetry she had ordered from the publisher in Denver. She set the book down and looked at the apple trees. "I think we should replant the north too," she said. "They are not producing the way they should. I think the roots have gone too deep and they are competing with the stone." "I was thinking the same thing last week," he said. "We should have discussed it. We are discussing it now." "We should have discussed it last week," she said. "Fair," he said. She picked the book back up and set it down again. "Do you know what I was thinking this morning?" she said. "I usually have some idea," he said, "but tell me." "I was thinking about the night you came back," she said. "That first night, you on the porch bleeding and exhausted, and I stood there with the lamp and I thought about closing the door." "I know," he said. "I could see it in your face. I am glad I did not." "So am I," he said. "Considerably." She smiled at him, the full open smile, and the June evening was warm around them and the farm was full and living, and all the children they had made together were out in the world being their exact particular selves, and the life that had come through that open door was complete and present and entirely real. "I am done running," she said, echoing his words from that night quietly without irony as a statement of shared fact. He looked at her. "Yes," he said, "we both are." She put her hand over his on the porch arm, and they sat in the summer evening with the apple trees heavy with fruit, and the new century going on around them and all of it, every improbable, costly, deeply worthwhile piece of it theirs. That was how it ended. Not with a dramatic conclusion, but with an evening on a porch in June, and two people who had found each other through betrayal and secrets and a dark past, and a forbidden love, and the ultimate sacrifice of a man choosing to stop running and a woman choosing to open a door. That was how it ended, which is to say it did not end at all. It went on. It was still going on. The farm and the family and the particular irreplaceable ongoing life of two people who had been worth the finding and worth the keeping. It went on the way the best things do, quietly, and for a long time and with great depth.